The rig was called Diamond 9, and it was sitting on a patch of playa 41 miles north of Tonopah when I drove out to relieve the day supervisor. I remember the odometer more clearly than the sunset. 247 miles from my apartment in Reno, and the last 30 of them were on a service road that wasn't on any map the state would admit to printing. I had a thermos of coffee, a laminated shift sheet, and a company phone that stopped pulling signals somewhere around mile 200. That was normal. Out there, you learn not to notice when the world stops answering. I want to say this cleanly, because I've tried to tell it 3 or 4 times now, and it comes out wrong when I rush. I'm going to go in order, the way I wrote it in the daily log before the log stopped being mine. My name doesn't matter for this. And what matters is that I was 41 years old. I'd been supervising deep water and mineral exploration wells for 11 years. And I had never, not once, filed a report I couldn't sign my name to without hesitation. I tell you that not because I'm proud of it. I tell you so you understand that when I finally did hesitate, it wasn't a small thing. Diamond 9 was a geothermal test bore. That's the shorthand. The longer version is that a lithium consortium out of Vancouver had leased a 30-section block and wanted to know whether the heat gradient beneath the basin could justify a pilot plant. The contract called for a single vertical well to 3,000 meters, with continuous telemetry and a mud logging unit running around the clock. My job was to watch the numbers, sign off on the rig crew's shift reports, and keep the company man in Vancouver informed via a satellite uplink that worked about 4 hours out of every 24. The crew on nights was 5 men. A driller named Backer, who I'd worked with twice before and liked. A derrick hand named Luis. 2 floor hands whose names I'm not going to use because one of them is dead now and the other won't answer my calls. And a mud logger named Peter Garza, who sat in a metal shack next to the substructure and watched gas chromatograph readings scroll across a monitor the color of a swimming pool. Peter is important. I'll come back to him. The first night I was there, we were at 2,460 meters. The formation had been basalt for the last 300 meters, and before that, a welded tuff that drilled like concrete and wore out bits faster than the contract allowed. The rate of penetration was slow. 8 meters an hour on a good shift, 4 on a bad one. Nothing interesting had come up in the cuttings for weeks. That was the word Backer used when he briefed me. Uneventful? He said it like it was a compliment to the whole. I signed in at 10 minutes past 6 in the evening, walked the rig floor with him for the handover, drank a cup of coffee from the crew trailer, and climbed up into the doghouse to start my shift. The doghouse is just what it sounds like. A small steel room perched on the substructure with a window looking down at the rotary table and another looking out at the desert. I had a desk, a radio, a screen showing the real-time drilling parameters, and a chair with a split cushion that someone had repaired with duct tape. I settled in. I logged the handover. I watched the bit grind at 170 revolutions per minute into rock that was, as far as anyone knew, the same rock it had been grinding into for a week. The first anomaly came at 2:17 in the morning. I want to be careful here, because the word anomaly makes it sound larger than it was. It wasn't large. It was a 12-second drop in standpipe pressure, followed by a slow recovery. On any other well, in any other formation, it would have meant a small void. A fracture the bit had passed through. Drilling fluid briefly rushing into the empty space before the formation sealed itself or the pumps compensated. I marked it in the log. I radioed Backer on the floor and asked if he'd felt anything. He said the bit had gone soft for about 2 seconds, then firmed up. Rate of penetration had jumped to 14 meters an hour for the length of the soft interval, then dropped back to 6. I asked him how big he thought the void was. He said, based on the ROP and the pressure signature, Maybe 30 centimeters. A fracture. Nothing to write home about. I wrote it home anyway, because that's the job. At 3 in the morning, I typed a short note into the daily report. Minor pressure fluctuation at 2,463 meters, duration 12 seconds, interpreted as small natural fracture. Recommend continued monitoring. I saved the file. I drank more coffee. The rig noise settled back into its usual rhythm, which is something between a heartbeat and a grinding of teeth, and I watched the numbers scroll. At 4:40, the pressure dropped again. Same signature. 12 seconds. Slow recovery. I stared at the trace on the screen for a long time before I picked up the radio. 2 identical fractures, 2 hours apart, at the same depth. That wasn't a fracture. That was a pattern. Patterns in drilling data usually mean an instrument problem, a pump cycling, something mechanical upstream. I called Bakker again and asked him to check the mud pumps. He walked the line, came back, said they were fine. I asked him to have Peter look at the gas readings for the last 3 hours and tell me if anything had shifted. Peter came on the radio a few minutes later. His voice was the voice of a man who had been awake for 9 hours in a metal shack and was chewing sunflower seeds to stay that way. He said the gas was flat. No methane spike, no H2S, no CO2. Just the background ratios you'd expect from basalt. Then he paused and said something that I didn't understand at the time, and I want to tell you exactly how he said it, because later it mattered. He said, "The baseline moved, though." I asked him what he meant. He said the chromatograph's baseline, the flat line the instrument holds when nothing's coming through, had shifted about an hour ago. Not by much, a few parts per million. But it had shifted, and it hadn't shifted back. He said it was probably a calibration drift. He said he'd run a cal gas through the unit in the morning. I wrote that in the log too. Baseline drift noted on GC, Peter to recalibrate on day shift. I signed the entry. At 6, Bakker came up to the doghouse with fresh coffee, and I handed off to the day supervisor, while I drove the 4 miles to the crew trailer and slept for 8 hours with the blackout curtains pulled. I think you should understand the rhythm of a place like that before I keep going, because the rhythm is part of what happened. A remote rig is its own small country. The crew trailers sit in a row. The rig itself is maybe 200 yards off, floodlit at night, visible from anywhere on the pad. There's a generator that hums. There's a water truck that comes twice a week. There's a cook who makes the same 4 meals on a rotation and pretends not to notice when you take a second helping. You get up, you eat, you work 12 hours, you eat, you sleep. The desert around you is flat and pale and goes on past the horizon in every direction. And at night, the sky is so full of stars, it looks dusty. You stop thinking about the outside world. You stop, almost, thinking about yourself. You become a set of procedures attached to a man. I tell you that because I want you to understand that when things began to change, they changed inside a context that was already very quiet. There wasn't much room for a loud anomaly. Everything had to announce itself softly, and I had to be listening, or I would have missed it entirely. On my second night, the pressure dropped 3 times. 217, 440, 703. I noticed the interval before I noticed anything else. 2 hours and 23 minutes between the first and second. 2 hours and 23 minutes between the second and third. I sat in the doghouse with my coffee going cold and did the math on a notepad, because I wanted to be sure I wasn't pattern matching on nothing. The intervals were identical to the second. I called Peter on the radio. "You seeing anything on the GC?" He said no. Baseline still drifted, a little further than yesterday, but flat otherwise. Then he said, "You seeing something up there?" I told him about the intervals. He was quiet for long enough that I thought the radio had dropped. Then he said, "You want me to come up?" I said yes. Peter was 46, Mexican-American, born in El Paso, a geologist who'd gone into mud logging because it paid better and let him stay out of offices. He had a long face and a way of listening that made you feel like he was building a map of what you were saying while you said it. He climbed up into the doghouse with his laptop under one arm and a bag of seeds in the other hand and sat down in the chair opposite mine. I showed him the traces. 3 pressure drops, clean as anything. He looked at them for maybe 2 minutes without speaking. Then he pulled up his own data on his laptop and set it next to my screen. And he said, "Look." His baseline, the flat line the chromatograph held between events, had stepped up 3 times. Once at 217, once at 440, once at 703. Each step was small, maybe half a part per million. But the steps matched my pressure drops to the second. We sat with that for a while. Peter said finally, "The hole's breathing." I asked him what he meant. He said that when a well penetrates a pressurized void, gas sometimes pulses out in cycles. The formation pressure cycles against the mud column weight, and you get a rhythmic exchange. He'd seen it once in Oklahoma, but the intervals there had been seconds, not hours. And the pressure drops had been large, measurable in hundreds of psi. What we had was tiny, subtle, almost within instrument noise. "And if it is breathing," I said, "what's it breathing?" He looked at his baseline numbers. He said, "Something I don't have in my library." I'm going to move forward now because I know how this sounds. And I know that the careful part of you is already doing the same thing I did that night, which is look for the explanation that makes it ordinary. I did that too. I spent the next 3 days doing it. I checked the pumps, I checked the manifold. I had Bakker pull the screens on the shale shakers and look for anything unusual in the cuttings. I had Peter recalibrate the GC twice with fresh cal gas. And both times the baseline came back to normal for about 40 minutes and then began to drift upward again in that same quiet, deliberate way. Nothing was wrong with the rig. Everything on the rig was behaving the way rigs behave. And yet, every 2 hours and 23 minutes, something 2.5 kilometers below us was taking a small breath. And something in Peter's instruments was tasting it. On the 4th night, the interval changed. It dropped to 2 hours and 16 minutes. On the 5th, it was 2 hours and 8. On the 6th, 2 hours and 1. I want to tell you how I felt about that. But the truth is, I didn't feel anything yet. And I was still in the part of the job where you name things and write them down. An accelerating cycle. A tightening rhythm. I sent a note up the chain to Vancouver, flagged as a drilling anomaly, requesting a senior engineer review. The reply came back 30 hours later and said, essentially, keep drilling, keep logging, we'll evaluate at the next cased section. The company man's name on the reply was someone I'd never heard of. I checked the org chart on the shared drive. He wasn't on it. I assumed he was new. I kept drilling. The thing that changed everything, and I mean this precisely, I am not being dramatic, happened on the 9th night, at 4 in the morning, at a depth of 2,611 meters. I was in the doghouse. Peter was in his shack. Bakker was on the floor. It was the quietest part of the shift, and the part where even the rig seems to be holding its breath a little. And then the standpipe pressure dropped. It didn't recover. It kept dropping. Slowly, smoothly, the way a glass fills when you tip it. The mud pumps compensated, and the pressure leveled at about 60% of normal. And the rate of penetration doubled, then tripled, and the bit began to turn as if there was nothing beneath it. I called Bakker on the radio. He was already shouting over the noise of the floor. He said the drill string had just dropped. Not a kick, not a pressure event. The bit had fallen. He estimated 3 meters, then caught. He'd already hit the brake and was pulling off bottom. He wanted to know what I wanted him to do. I told him to pull off bottom and circulate. Standard procedure when you hit a void. You stop, you pump clean mud. You let the hole stabilize, and you look at what you've got before you go any further. He said, already doing it, and hung up. I called Peter. Peter's voice, when he came on, was different. It was the voice of a man who has seen a reading he doesn't want to report. He said, "You need to come down here." I left the doghouse. The desert air was cold, the way it gets at 4 in the morning in the Great Basin, and I remember that the floodlights on the rig threw long, flat shadows across the pad, and that my own shadow, walking ahead of me toward Peter's shack, looked thin and tall and not quite like me. I'm telling you that because it was the first small wrongness I remember noticing in myself. A shape I didn't quite recognize. I pushed it aside and kept walking. Peter's shack was warm and smelled like coffee and electrical components. He had 3 monitors running. One showed the gas chromatograph, one showed the mud density, one showed a camera feed from the possum belly. The tray under the shakers where the returning mud ran past a sensor. He pointed at the middle monitor. "Mud density dropped," he said. And then it came back up, with something in it. He clicked through the chromatograph readings. The baseline, which had been stepping upward in those small, patient increments, had jumped. Not a step, a spike. Then it had dropped below its original flat line. Then it had settled back to the new, higher baseline, about 10 parts per million above where we'd started 9 days ago. "What's the gas?" I asked. He said, "I don't know." He said it the way a doctor says he doesn't know. Not as a confession of ignorance, but as a flag, and as a statement that something was outside his training in a way that concerned him. He said, "It's heavier than methane. It's not CO2. It's not H2S. It matches a couple of hydrocarbons I have on file, but only in part. The decay signature is wrong. Things don't decay like this." He pointed at a trace on the screen that looked, to me, like any other trace. A peak rising, falling, rising again. "What do I tell Vancouver?" I asked. He said, "Tell them we hit a void and we're circulating." So that's what I told them. I sent the report at 4:30 in the morning, flagged as urgent, and I sat in the doghouse for the next 2 hours, watching the mud return rate and waiting for the company to wake up. At 6:40, while I was waiting for the handover, the radio crackled. It was Bakker. He said, "Boss, you hearing this?" I said, "Hearing what?" He said, "Come down." The drill floor at a rig under circulation is not loud exactly, but it's full of noise. Mud pumps working, shakers running, the low grinding of the rotary when it's idling. You get used to the mix. You stop hearing the parts and only hear the whole. If one element falls out, it's like a chord missing a note. I walked out onto the floor with Bakker, and he pointed down into the bell nipple, the wide steel funnel where the mud comes up out of the hole, and he said, "Listen." I listened. Under the noise of the pumps, under the hum of the shakers, there was a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud. It wasn't continuous. It came in soft cycles, about 2 seconds long each, with a pause of maybe 3 seconds between them. A slow, wet, soft sound. Something like a man breathing through a damp cloth, but deeper and further away, and completely without urgency. I stood there for about a minute, trying to decide if I was hearing it or imagining it. Bakker stood beside me, not moving, watching my face. When he saw that I had it, he said, "Yeah." I said, "That's the hole." He said, "Yeah." I said, "How long?" He said, "Maybe 20 minutes." It started quiet. It's been getting louder. The sound went on. Soft, regular, patient. It didn't match the pumps. It didn't match the shakers. It was underneath everything, rising up through the steel of the bell nipple as if the well itself was a throat and something at the bottom had begun, very softly, to use it. I want to tell you that I felt fear, right then, in a clean, uncomplicated way. But that isn't what I felt. What I felt was something closer to embarrassment. As if I'd walked in on something private, and the correct response was to back away quietly and pretend I hadn't. I remember thinking, very clearly, that the sound was not meant for me, and that my listening to it was a kind of rudeness. That was my first indication that something had gotten into me already. Not into the rig. Into me. I didn't back away. I stood there and I listened to the hole breathe for another 2 minutes. And then I walked back up to the doghouse and I did my job. I wrote in the log, audible cyclic sound emanating from wellbore during circulation, period approximately 5 seconds, origin unknown, investigating. I signed it. I handed off to the day supervisor, who was a man named Ron Beckett, and I watched his face while I told him what we'd heard. He didn't laugh. He didn't look at me like I was losing it. He just nodded slowly and said, "I'll keep an ear on it." I drove to the trailer. I lay down. I didn't sleep. The air conditioner hummed. The generator hummed. I lay there and listened to them both for 4 hours with my eyes open, and every so often, underneath them, I thought I heard the other sound, the one from the bell nipple, coming up through the floor of the trailer. I told myself that was impossible. I told myself my ears were tired. I told myself the rig was 200 yards away, and there was no mechanical path for the sound to travel. I told myself those things. And then, at some point around noon, I fell asleep. And I dreamed about a long, narrow room with no ceiling, in which something was waiting very patiently for me to finish what I was doing so it could begin. Decalster. On the 10th night, Ron Beckett met me at the trailer at 5:45 and said he wanted to walk over to the rig with me. That was unusual. The day and night supervisors usually handed off in the doghouse, not on foot. I asked him if something had happened. He said, "Not exactly." We walked across the pad. The sun was behind the mountains to the west, and the floodlights were coming on one by one as the photocells tripped. He kept his hands in his jacket pockets. He was a heavy man, late 50s, a Texan, with a kind of face that didn't give anything away unless it wanted to. He said, "You hear it, right? The breathing." I said, "I hear it." He said, "I heard it on day shift too. Different rhythm." I stopped walking. He kept going a few steps, then stopped and turned. "What do you mean, different rhythm?" He said, Longer. About 8 seconds between. Slower." "And at night?" 5. I said, "The hole breathes faster at night." He said, "Looks that way." We walked the rest of the way in silence. When we got to the substructure, he turned to me and said something I've thought about many times since. He said, "I've been on 2 wells that did weird things. This isn't the weirdest, but it's the one that feels like it knows I'm here." Then he climbed up into his truck and drove back to the trailer, and I was alone with the rig for another 12 hours. The readings that night were the cleanest I'd seen since it started. The pressure cycles had smoothed out into a steady, slow rhythm, almost exactly matching the audible breathing. The gas baseline had risen another 8 parts per million. The rate of penetration, and now that we were back on bottom with a new bit, was unusually high. 14 meters an hour through what should have been basalt. Peter came up to the doghouse around midnight and said the cuttings were wrong. I asked him what he meant by wrong. He laid out a sample tray on my desk. Normally, cuttings from basalt are dark gray to black, glassy, angular, the size of coarse sand. What he had in the tray was the same size and angularity, but the color was wrong. It was a pale, uniform, slightly warm gray, like the color of dry bone that had been left in the sun for a long time. And when I looked closer, I could see that the individual grains had a faint sheen to them, not the glassy sheen of fresh basalt. Something softer, almost waxy. I picked one up between my thumb and finger. It was warm, not hot. Warm, the way a coin feels after it's been in your pocket. Peter watched me hold it. He said, "They were warmer when they came up. They've been cooling for about 20 minutes. I put the grain back in the tray. I asked him if he'd sent a sample to the lab in Reno. He said yes. He said he'd put it in the courier bag for the morning truck. Then he said, "Boss, I don't think that sample's going to arrive." I asked him what he meant. He said, "I sent one 2 days ago. It didn't arrive. I called the lab. They said the bag came in empty except for paperwork." I stared at him. He said, "I'm not saying anything. I'm just telling you." He left. I sat with the tray of warm cuttings on my desk for the rest of the shift, and every 20 minutes or so I touched one of them to see if it had gone cold. And they all did eventually, but slower than they should have. The last one I touched, just before 6 in the morning, was still faintly warm when I put it down. I want to talk for a minute about what was happening to me internally during this time, because I think it's important, and I think I owe it to you to be honest about it. I was not afraid. That was the strangest part. I had spent 11 years expecting that if I ever encountered something I couldn't explain, I would be afraid. And I was not. What I felt instead was a deep, steady, almost pleasant attentiveness. The way you feel when you're listening to a piece of music you've never heard before, but already like. I wanted to understand what was happening. I wanted to keep watching it. And underneath those wants, which were familiar to me as a professional, there was something else. A quieter want. The want of a man who has realized that the thing he is watching is also, in some sense, watching back. And who has decided, without saying so to himself, that he would like to be watched a little longer before he looks away. I didn't name that then. I'm naming it now because I've had 4 years to think about it. At the time, I just kept working. On the 11th night, Peter didn't show up for shift. The driller before Backer, a man named Cooley, told me Peter had packed his gear into his truck at the end of day shift and driven off the pad without signing out. He hadn't said goodbye. He hadn't left a note. His mud logging shack was locked. His laptop was gone. The chromatograph was still running on its own, logging to a hard drive that, I would later discover, had been wiped too within the last 18 hours. Thus I called the company man in Vancouver on the satellite uplink and reported him missing. The company man said they'd look into it. He asked me, in a careful voice, whether Peter had seemed unstable in the days leading up to his departure. I said no. I said Peter had seemed more stable than I was. There was a pause on the line. Then the company man said, "We'll send a replacement." The replacement arrived the next morning. A young woman, mid-30s, from Calgary. Her name was Ellis. She was competent, polite, and had a way of not asking questions that felt, from the first hour, deliberate. When I tried to tell her about the pressure cycles, she nodded and said she'd been briefed. When I mentioned the breathing sound, she said she'd been briefed on that too. When I asked her who had briefed her, she said Vancouver, and then she changed the subject to the Cal gas inventory. I let it go. I had a shift to run. But that evening, when I walked past the mud logging shack on my way to the doghouse, I saw through the window that Ellis had her laptop open, and that the screen was displaying what looked like a spectrogram, and that the spectrogram had annotations on it in a font and a format I didn't recognize. She wasn't looking at the chromatograph. She was looking at a waveform. And the waveform, to my eyes, which are not trained for this, looked very much like a recording of something breathing. I didn't stop. I kept walking. I signed in at the doghouse. I drank my coffee. I watched the numbers scroll. The 12th night is the one I want to describe carefully, because it's the night the thing that had been underneath us began. For the first time, I to be interested in being somewhere else. At 2:17 in the morning, the rig went quiet. Not entirely. The generator kept humming. The floodlights kept burning. But the mud pumps stopped. The shakers stopped. The rotary stopped. The rig floor, which had been producing its heartbeat of grinding noise for 2 straight weeks, went silent in the space of about 4 seconds. The breathing didn't stop. I was in the doghouse when it happened. I saw the pump pressure drop to 0 on my screen, and I heard the mechanical sounds fall away outside, and I heard, in the sudden quiet, the sound coming up out of the bell nipple. It was louder than it had been during circulation, much louder. Now that nothing else was competing with it, I could hear its edges, the wet softness of it, the slight catch at the top of each cycle, unlike a man adjusting his breath before the next inhale, the patience in it. I picked up the radio and called Bakker. He didn't answer. I called the floor. I called the tool pusher's trailer. I called Ellis in the mud shack. Nobody answered. I sat in the doghouse with the radio in my hand and the breathing coming up through the floor. And I understood, in a way I had not understood before, that I was alone on the rig. I want to describe what I did next carefully, because I think about it often. I did not panic. I did not run. I did not call the company. I picked up my flashlight. I clipped my radio to my belt. And I walked out of the doghouse and down the stairs to the rig floor. The rig floor was empty. The drawworks were idle. The rotary was stopped. The V-door stood open to the desert. I walked across the deck plate to the bell nipple, and I looked down into it. The mud level had dropped. Normally, during circulation, the mud in the bell nipple is right at the top, flowing over into the flow line and out to the shakers. When the pumps stop, the level should hold, because the hole is full. What I saw, when I looked down, was a column of mud that had dropped about 3 feet below the rim, below the level of the flow line, below the level at which the hole could still be considered full. And the mud was moving. Not flowing, moving, rising and falling very slightly, in the rhythm of the breathing. Up 2 inches, down 2 inches, up 2 inches, down 2 inches. I stood there and watched it for I don't know how long. Long enough that my flashlight beam began to feel heavy in my hand. Long enough that I noticed my own breath had synchronized with the breath coming out of the hole, and had been synchronized, maybe, for some time. I broke the rhythm on purpose. I held my breath for a count of 10. I let it out. I breathed in a pattern I chose. The mud kept moving in its own pattern, indifferent to mine. I walked back to the doghouse. I wrote in the log. At 2:17, all rig machinery ceased operation simultaneously. Crew unreachable by radio. Wellbore fluid level dropped approximately 90 centimeters and is exhibiting slow oscillation consistent with prior audible phenomenon. I signed the entry. I noted the time. I sat down in my chair. At 2:41, the pumps came back on. I didn't start them. Nobody started them. The pump motors simply engaged, and the pressure came up on the standpipe, and the shakers began running. Us and the rotary, which had been idle, began to turn at its previous RPM without any command from the driller's console. I watched it happen on my screens. I watched the parameters come back to life as if nothing had happened. The radio crackled. Backer's voice said, "Boss?" I said, "Where were you?" There was a pause. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I called you. I called the floor. I called everyone. Nobody answered for 24 minutes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Boss, we've been running the whole time. Luis is right here. We just finished a connection. You didn't call." I looked at my radio. I looked at the log entry I had just written. I looked at the timestamp on the entry. 2:19. I looked at the timestamp on the pump pressure drop on my screen. 2:17. I looked at the timestamp on the pump pressure recovery. 2:41. On my screens, the pump pressure had dropped to 0 and recovered 24 minutes later. On Backer's console, according to him, the pumps had never stopped. I'd like to tell you that I understood what had happened, but I didn't. I don't still. What I have is a series of possibilities, and I've ranked them by how much they frighten me, and the order changes depending on my mood. The first possibility is that I fell asleep in the doghouse and dreamed the whole thing. I've considered this one carefully. I don't believe it. My log entry is in my handwriting, signed and timed, and the entry before and after it are consistent with a man who was awake. My coffee cup, which I'd poured at 2, was cold when I finished the shift at 6, which is about right for a man who drank it slowly over 4 hours, not for a man who slept through 20 minutes of it. The second possibility is that something in the rig's telemetry created a false reading, and that I walked out onto a rig floor where everything was, in fact, still running, and I was so primed by the false reading that I saw what I expected to see. I've considered this one too. It doesn't account for the mud level in the bell nipple, which I remember with absolute clarity. It doesn't account for the silence, which was not a silence of instrumentation, but a silence of the world. The third possibility is the one I keep coming back to, and I'll say it once, and then I'll move on. The third possibility is that for 24 minutes, the rig and I were somewhere the rest of the crew was not, and something down below us used that time to examine me the way a man examines a small animal that has wandered into his yard. And then it put me back. Ellis came to the doghouse at 5:30. She knocked on the door, which surprised me. Nobody knocks on a doghouse door. They just come in. I said, "Come in." And she opened the door and stood in the frame with her hands at her sides. She said, "I need to show you something." She had a printout in her hand. She set it on my desk. It was a spectrogram, a wide band of frequencies plotted against time, with the intensity of each frequency shown as a color. The spectrogram covered a 1-hour window from 2 in the morning to 3. Across the middle of it, from about 2:17 to 2:41, there was a band. The band was narrow, like it was centered at a frequency Ellis had labeled in small, neat handwriting. 0.19 hertz, about 1 cycle every 5 seconds. The period of the breathing. "This is from the geophone string," she said. "The one the seismic contractor left on site. I don't think anyone's been monitoring it." I said, "You were monitoring it." She said, "I'm supposed to." I asked her what the band meant. She said, "It means that for 24 minutes, something 2 kilometers below this rig was producing a coherent low-frequency signal. Not breathing. That's not breathing. That's a machine, or something like a machine. It ran for 24 minutes, and then it stopped. I asked her if the signal had been there before. She said, yes, intermittently, for the last 9 days. But it was weaker. Tonight was the first time it was this clean. I asked her who else she was sending this data to. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, that's not my part of the job. She took the printout back. She said, I thought you should see it. I don't think you should say you saw it. She left. I finished my rotation. 14 nights. I did not report the 24-minute silence to Vancouver. I did not mention the spectrogram. I wrote my daily logs in language that was accurate but uninteresting. Minor pressure fluctuations continued. Rate of penetration stable. Crew performance satisfactory. I handed off to Ron Beckett on my last morning, and he looked at me for a long time before he said, you getting off the hitch? I said, going home for 3 weeks. He said, good. He didn't say anything else. He climbed up into the doghouse, and I climbed down. And I drove the 247 miles back to Reno. And when I got to my apartment, I sat on the couch in my coat for about an hour before I could make myself take it off. The 3 weeks of my rotation off were normal. I want to say that because it matters. I slept, I ate, I saw my brother, who lives in Carson City. I took my truck in for an oil change. I called my mother, who is in a memory care facility in Spokane, and talked to her for 20 minutes about nothing. I did laundry. I paid bills. I did not hear breathing anywhere. I did not notice anything unusual in my apartment or in my body or in my thoughts. I want to say that because what comes next is not a story about a man being haunted. It's a story about a man realizing, slowly, that he had been changed in a way that didn't announce itself, and that the change was waiting for him to come back. I went back to Diamond 9 on the last Sunday in October. The drive was the same. The service road was the same. The pad was the same. The rig was there, floodlit against the dusk. And when I drove up to the trailer row, I saw Backer's truck and Luis's truck and a new truck I didn't recognize. I parked. I got out. I stood in the cold desert air for a minute and listened. I didn't hear breathing. I heard the rig. The normal noise of a rig, unbroken. Ron Beckett was in the trailer, eating beef stew. He looked up when I came in and said, you look rested. I said I was. He said, good, because I'm not. He briefed me in about 15 minutes. The well had reached 2,980 meters during my absence. The formation had turned, in the last 300 meters, from basalt into something the geologists were calling anomalous. He used the air quotes. He said the cuttings were coming up that same pale, warm gray, and they were getting warmer. The last sample he'd sent to the lab had arrived intact and had been returned without analysis, with a note from the lab director saying the sample was outside their capability. He said the pressure cycles had stopped. He said, no more breathing. 4 days now, just quiet. I asked him if Ellis was still on site. He said, Ellis left, a week ago. New mud logger is Canadian too. Guy named Dweck. Doesn't talk much. I asked him if Peter had ever turned up. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, Nick, you didn't hear? I said, hear what? He said, they found his truck, up near Austin, empty. No sign of him. Family's still looking. I sat with that for a while. And then I said, when do I start? He said, tonight. I climbed up into the doghouse at 6. I signed in. I did the handover. I watched the numbers scroll. For the first 6 hours, nothing happened. The rig ran. The bit ground. The ROP was steady at 10 meters an hour. Mud density held. Gas baseline was flat, exactly flat. And when I looked at the baseline record for the last week, I saw that it had not moved once. Not a drift, not a step. Flat. At 1 in the morning, I walked out onto the rig floor. Bakker was at the brake. He nodded at me. I walked to the bell nipple and I looked down. The mud was still. No oscillation, no cycling. A just dark fluid moving in the steady direction of circulation. I listened. I heard the pumps, the shakers, the rotary. I did not hear anything else. I walked back up to the doghouse. I drank my coffee. I watched the numbers scroll. And around 3 in the morning, I noticed something that I want to describe to you precisely, because I think it is the thing this whole story has been building toward, and the thing I haven't told anyone until now. I noticed that my own breathing had a small catch in it at the top. Not every breath, every fourth or fifth. A tiny hitch, almost imperceptible, like a momentary pause before the inhale completed. I only noticed because I had spent 12 nights, a month earlier, listening to that exact pattern coming up out of the ground. I held my hand against my chest and I breathed for a while with my eyes closed. And I counted. And yes, it was there. Once every 4 or 5 breaths, a small, soft hitch at the top of the inhale. My body had, somewhere in the last 6 weeks, learned a new rhythm, and the rhythm was not mine. I opened my eyes. I looked at the screens. The gas baseline, which had been flat for a week, was stepping upward, half a part per million, then half a part per million more, then half a part per million more. I watched it step for about 10 minutes. Then I picked up the radio and I called Bakker and I said, "Pull off bottom. I want to circulate clean." He said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Just do it." He did it. The ROP dropped to 0. The pump circulated. The baseline kept stepping. It stepped for another 40 minutes, and then it held. I didn't write it in the log. I want you to understand what I'm telling you. I didn't write it in the log. I have written every anomaly on every well I have ever supervised, without exception, for 11 years. I did not write this one. I watched it happen. I watched the number rise. And I sat in the doghouse and I felt the small hitch at the top of my breath. And I said nothing. I told myself I would watch it for one more shift and then decide. That was 4 years ago. I am still on Diamond 9. Different rigs, different pads, different basins, but the same well, which is what I've come to call the thing that I am doing. Because I have realized that I am not supervising a drilling operation anymore. I am supervising a conversation. The consortium in Vancouver folded 2 years ago, and the lease was acquired by another company whose name doesn't appear on any document I sign. The new company man is polite and never asks me questions I can't answer. My check's clear. My rotations are regular. 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off. On my weeks off, I go home to Reno. I eat, I sleep, I call my mother, I take my truck in for service. I do laundry. I see my brother. I am by any measure available to him or to her or to the man at the oil change place. A normal man in his mid-40s who has a steady job in the extractive industries and a small, quiet life. The hitch in my breath is still there. It has gotten slightly more regular. It is now every 3rd breath, not every 4th or 5th. I no longer notice it unless I am lying awake, which I do sometimes, in the hour before dawn, listening to the refrigerator cycle and the heater hum, and underneath them, a softer sound that I am fairly sure is only in my head. Here is the thing I want to tell you. The thing I want you to take from all of this, if you take anything. The well did not stop breathing. The well learned to breathe so quietly that the instruments no longer register it. The baseline on the GC is flat because the breath has moved below the detection threshold. The pressure cycles are gone because the cycles have slowed to a period longer than any shift. The audible breathing in the bell nipple has moved to a frequency no human ear is built to hear. Whatever is down there did not leave. It adjusted. It made itself small enough that the system, including me, could continue. And in exchange for that smallness, it asked for something, and I have been giving it a little at a time for 4 years. I don't know what it is I am giving. I don't feel any smaller. I don't feel sick. I don't feel afraid. I feel, most of the time, a quiet, steady attentiveness, the way you feel when you're listening to a piece of music you've heard many times before and still like. I do my job. I sign my logs. I come home. Last week, in my apartment in Reno, I was making coffee in the kitchen, and I heard, through the wall, my neighbor in the next unit breathing in her sleep. She is an older woman. She keeps her bedroom on the other side of my kitchen wall. The walls in this building are thin. I have heard her snore many times over the 3 years she has lived there. She is a familiar presence in the edge of my life. I stood at the counter with a coffee scoop in my hand. And I listened to her breathe, and I counted. And on the 4th breath, there was a small, soft hitch at the top of her inhale. And on the 4th breath after that. And on the 4th breath after that. I put the coffee scoop down. I went into the living room. I sat on the couch with my coat still on, the way I had sat 4 years earlier after my first rotation. I sat there for a long time. I did not go back into the kitchen. I have not gone back into the kitchen yet. I have been making my coffee at the gas station on the corner. I tell myself I will go back when I'm ready. I tell myself it was a coincidence. I tell myself my neighbor is an older woman with a respiratory pattern that is, by any reasonable medical standard, within normal variation. I tell myself those things. And underneath them, in a place I have stopped examining, I am already beginning to wonder about the man at the oil change place, and about my brother in Carson City, and about my mother in her bed in Spokane, and about how long it has been, really, since I have listened to any of them breathe with the kind of attention I used to save for the bell nipple of a well in the middle of the Nevada desert. I am going to stop writing this now. My rotation starts again in 9 days. I'll drive out. I'll sign in. I'll watch the numbers scroll. Somewhere below me, 2.5 kilometers of rock will be holding its breath in a rhythm so slow it no longer registers on any instrument I have. And I will sit in the doghouse with my coffee, and I will listen, and I will wait for the small, soft hitch at the top of my inhale. And when it comes, I will not write it down. And I haven't decided yet whether that is a decision I am making, or a decision that was made for me a long time ago. Somewhere down at the bottom of a hole I should never have looked into, by something that has all the patience in the world and no reason at all to hurry. I think, most nights, that the distinction doesn't matter. And then I remember that I promised myself I would stop thinking in those terms. Because thinking in those terms is one of the things it taught me. And I sit very still in the dark, and I try to breathe in a pattern I chose. And I listen to the refrigerator, and I wait for morning.